Welcome everybody to Getting APIs to Work. Today we say hello to Mike Amundsen, and Mike said why I stopped using Post and learned to love HTTP. And this is what we'll talk about today. So really HTTP details, HTTP semantics. Mike, why did you stop using Post?
Well, here's the deal. I'm spending a lot of time over these last several months writing machine-to-machine interactions over HTTP. And I'm doing a lot of server-to-service kind of connections and some complex workflow experiments. And I was getting frustrated every once in a while. If something went wrong, I would do a post and create a record, and I would never get a response back. And I was never really sure if I could repeat the record or if I duplicated records. It was just getting kind of annoying. I was getting frustrated. So I said, there's got to be a better way. And I decided to take a look at the spec, look through some details. And I decided to switch to creating records using put instead of post. And after working out a few details, it just got so handy that I've just decided I'm not using post anymore. When I write my services, everyone's going to create records using put instead. So I stopped using post entirely, and I got a much more dependable and automatable, automation-friendly set of services.
It's a good point. I think that I guess everybody has had problems with Post, right? Even end users, right? It's like you get these messages like, don't refresh that website or you will get 2 vacuum cleaners or whatever. And so it does take more than just using put instead of post to do that. So walk us through what you found and what you're using now as a pattern.
Right. So what I've discovered is there's this thing called conditional requests, and that was introduced into HTTP 1.1. And conditional requests is this idea that I can send you a get or a put or a delete or anything like that, and then say, I want you to execute this request based on a condition ahead of time. So conditional requests are pretty handy because they sort of add some efficiency to the system. I don't have to send large records if I don't have to. I don't have to do expensive computes and stuff like that if the conditions are in a certain way. Okay, and it turns out that this idea of conditional requests has its own RFC. RFC 7232 is just dedicated to the idea of all these possible things that you can do to create these more efficient requests. So this whole process it sort of mixes in the methods like get and put and delete and things like that, and some headers. So some headers were added into this 1.1, the if match, if none match, and entity tag. So it's kind of a mix of all those.
These are the advanced ones, right? So maybe for everybody else, just like the simple one is like if modified since and these kind of things, right? Where you can like for get requests, you can say, oh, I want to get this, but only if it has been modified since that date, right? So I think that is something that a lot of people are using. I think you were like diving a little deeper, right? You looked into the more advanced ones that maybe aren't quite as widespread when people use these conditional requests.
Yeah, I guess now I think the entity tag request for making get conditional is actually used pretty often, right? So what happens is when you create a response, you send this thing called an e tag or entity tag, which is a hash value that represents the request body and some headers and some other details. So that says this, it's like a signature for this request, for this resource. And that entity tag gets sent to the client. The browser does this really, really well. And then if you hit refresh, then the browser actually sends that tag along with the get request. And it sends it as an if match or an if none match, right? So it basically says, I would like you to send me the same resource again, get if none match this entity tag that I just sent you. So if it turns out somebody updated the record since I did the refresh, send me the new record. Otherwise, just don't send me anything at all. And that's the 304 response, which basically says not modified. So it goes back to your thing of modified since. So that's a pretty handy way to make sure that you don't keep sending the same resource over and over again. So that is really, really powerful. But you can also flip it. So you can use that if done match for put as well as get. You can use it for writing as well as reading. And that's what I did to replace post. So basically, what I did is I looked at the spec, and it basically says, if you send for that if none match, instead of having a specific value for a record, if you put an asterisk, a star, then it represents any possible representation at that resource address. So I do a put with a URL, if none match star, and then that makes sure that I can create a record and I don't overwrite any existing record that's already there. So that's a conditional put or a conditional write. So that's how I do creating of records.
So what you're saying, so to speak, in plain language then is put this representation at this URI if there is nothing there.
Right. Exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I can also then use the same situation if I want to update a record, right? So if I want to use put for updating, I use the if match and the entity tag, right? So if I create a record and then I get the location 201 and I get pointed to the new record, I'll get an entity tag, just like I was getting in the get situation. If I want to edit that record, I say if the representation matches this tag at this URL, go ahead and update it. However, if somebody else has updated the record before I had a chance to do it, the entity tags won't match. So then that put is conditional and the put will fail. It'll say, I'm sorry, Eric already updated that record. You don't have the most recent record. Why don't you get the most recent record and then try your edit again? So you can do it for both creating and updating.
I think for updating, it's actually, that's a pattern that is more popular, or it's used more often, right? Because you have these conflicting put requests that potentially can overwrite changes, right? And you can avoid that by doing this. There's one more, I think there's one more little twist to your solution that is necessary to make it work. So when putting, you have to come up with the URI you're putting to, right?
Yep.
How are you doing that?
Yeah, so especially in this machine case, I'm in the habit of either using a generated GUID, globally unique ID, or I use a timestamp, a hash timestamp value. So down to like the 100th of a second that creates just a string. So I create unique IDs on the client side. It's as if I was sort of uploading a file. Like if I'm uploading a file, I know the file name and I tell the server, here's, Mike's document .doc, and that's sort of using the same idea where I create the file name. So I will generate this value and then that becomes the ID on the server. Now, sometimes the server will then process that record and then create a new resource, and maybe the server gives it its own ID or something like that. But that's sort of extra, excuse me, that's a little bit extra that servers can decide what to do. But I usually use GUID or a timestamp generated ID on the client side to do that.
So it has to be something where the risk of conflicts is very low, right? You couldn't just use an integer or something like this, because then if you have multiple applications doing this, right, then the risk of conflicting things, of conflicting creates actually would be non-negligible, I guess.
Yep, that's exactly right. So it's basically the same kind of thing that a lot of systems do this, Kafka and other things where they write tons and tons of records. They just generate IDs on the fly based on GUIDs or timestamps. So it's just taking that and giving that power to the client to be able to do that as well. And that's what I do basically. Yeah.
One last thing. Now the pattern that you've described is that I put to a URI that I created. I do this conditional request. Now I could also do this with a post, right? I could post to that URI and I could use the same header fields for creating a conditional request. What made you prefer put over post in that scenario?
What made me prefer it was the idea that put is promised by the semantics of HTTP to be idempotent, which means that it's okay to repeat the action and expect the same results. So I was really looking for creating this sort of idempotent kind of experience. So I use get, put, and delete as my machine-to-machine kind of HTTP interactions, and all of those are idempotent requests in their description. Get is safe, and the other two are unsafe. But that was really what drove me to use put. And I tend to think of post as what we call you use a factory URL, right? You don't create the ID. You let the server create the ID. So in my head, I was saying, well, can I use an idempotent method? And that meant I would use post and create an ID. But I think, as we're talking about it, there may not be any technicality inside HTTP that prevents you from doing this same kind of thing with post, of making post conditional. I don't know that it's in the spec that way, but that might be possible.
I would be surprised if there was anything. I mean, as far as I can tell, you can do your whole API with just post, right? Like,
yes.
Because post is kind of like the catch-all method, right? It would be more inconvenient because you wouldn't have any safe methods and any idempotent methods. But I think there's nothing preventing you from doing that other than maybe having the good sense of not doing that. But I think it would be correct technically. So I'm pretty sure in your case you could do it. But as you said, right, it's pretty nice that now this request is something that can be repeated. It can be repeated from intermediaries. Right?
Yes.
If there's some component in the middle that realizes, oh, I never had a response. What do I do now? Right now, if you have an idempotent request, you can say, well, let's try again and see what happens. So I think that's actually a nice thing. Now, one last thing. Since you walked us through this way how HTTP allows you to do that and how the RFC specifies it, it seems to me what you're doing is just something that's just written in the spec. Is that true?
Yes. There's nothing. There's no real creative thinking here. I didn't invent anything. I actually, follow me, read the spec.
Yay! Yeah, that alone, I think, that alone sets you apart from pretty much everybody else.
But where I want to bask in the glory of actually being able to read and all that. But I will point out that when you and I were discussing this, I did not realize that in the latest update, conditional request got its own RFC. I thought it was still kind of folded in to the RFCs because I've got a copy of 2616 I keep reading over and over again. I'm still have to remind myself that there's an updated version. So there's a lot to read. I mean, it's not like it's a simple task. But this is totally all what's been in the spec for since 1998 is when the conditionals were introduced. So it's been there a long time. Been there 20 years, and it's very useful.
For sure.
Not brand new. Yeah. Not brand new in any way.
It's not brand new.
Yeah. And I'm actually very excited. It's changed the way I write my service code, because I write with these little facade tools. I use Node a lot, so I'll use Express and several other really simple tools that sort of expose these methods by just adding some headers, mapping these routines and getting services to talk to each other. Just feels a lot more stable, a lot more reliable. It's pretty rare that I get this kind of error, that I actually get no response back, but it definitely happens. And I will tell you that when it happens, mostly for me, which is not really a production case, it's when I'm doing experiments and one of my other services literally crashes or the machine's not reachable, and I used to have everything in a weird state, and it was kind of hard for me to put back together. But now, it's really easy to recover from a mistake like that.
I have no data to back this up, but I would assume that if you, for example, have APIs that you use for mobile apps, you would actually get quite a number of these things, right? If you have intermittent connectivity, somebody, gets off the network. So I wouldn't be surprised that at least in some of these scenarios where you aren't just nicely connected through Wi-Fi the whole time or through cable, right? That this actually is not an edge case, right? It's really something that happens routinely. So you better deal with it in a good way.
Yep, I bet
even
you're
if
right.
yeah, and even if it doesn't happen that often, right? You don't want these things to just like random stuff happens. So
yeah, absolutely. So it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and when you talked about reading the specs and stuff, it actually gave me this idea that maybe we should do a couple of episodes just reading the spec. Well, not literally reading it, but no, but just discussing, like you said, right? There's a whole spec on conditional requests, and that alone is something. Well, maybe you don't want to walk through all of the header fields, but just telling the story and saying, like if you have this case or if you have these problems, here's a whole thing to look at. And it's, as you said, it's a little bit to read through, but on the other hand, it's not hundreds of pages, right? It's something you can read that in an hour.
It's nice. Yeah, I like that idea a lot. It's a lot like just sort of having a handle on where everything is and like where to look, and the conditionals are here and the semantics are here and the transport is here. That's a really good idea. I think that's a nice set. Of course, I'm a geek. Like I would find this very enlightening and entertaining. So.
I'm sure we'll get thousands of viewers if we have a title like RFC 7232. Listen to us.
Yes. All right.
Okay, but this time we had like just a little part of it, and thanks for walking us through it, Mike. I think it was interesting, just that one example, and it was also interesting to see that, hey, it's in the spec, right? You just need to find out that you can do that, and then you can actually improve your API and get more out of your API design than you could do before. It's a good lesson.
Cool.
Thanks for joining, Mike, as usual. It's always great to have you. And
good to see you.
I hope everybody enjoyed the show. And until next time, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.